Coming up on episode 86 of the Behind the Back podcast, Ben and I go over the draft hauls for the Philadelphia Eagles and the San Francisco 49ers. And Ben elaborates on some fun news that we heard about a contract signing in April, not August. So Ben, stay tuned for what Ben's reaction is to that. And then we pivot on to finish with the Sacramento Kings. They kept Doug Christie. Ben and I offer our takes on how excited or maybe not that we are. So with that being said, y'all, let's get it. All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Behind the Back podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Marcos Conan Negron, and beside me here, as always, is Ben, the Jet. Rets, my brother, the draft is over. How are you feeling?
I'm doing really well, man. I had a good weekend, enjoyed watching the draft, and kicked off this week just kind of diving into the picks, and I'm ready to go. I'm feeling good.
Love that. We've been grinding the film, grinding the all 22s. As you guys saw in the intro, we have a lot of fun stuff to talk about. We're going to go through all of our draft picks as well as all of the news happening around the Eagles and the Niners and just kind of, touch up on some news that we got. And then we're going to finish off with some Sacramento Kings talk because they have some interesting news for us that we need to discuss. But we'll start off with football, and we're going to start with the Philadelphia Eagles. We're going to go over each and every draft pick. The Eagles made 10 draft picks in this draft. And, if we want to talk about, my initial reaction, just fresh off of the picks, I wasn't sure how I felt at first. And I was more excited for some of these picks than others. And we'll talk about that when we kind of go one by one here. But we're going to go through briefly. We're not going to spend a ton of time on a lot of these guys. Obviously, these day three guys, we're not going to pretend like we studied all the film on and got all this stuff on. So we'll go through these picks. Ben was locked in there. He was locked in. So we're going to go through, these picks and just kind of talk about, why we feel like the team went, why they went the way they did. We're going off of what they've said and mentioned as well. So we got all this intel from the weekend. The draft itself, I thought was fun. I thought watching it in general, I thought the event was really well done. I heard all the stuff about the prank calls, sucks to be the players and all that stuff. But I thought overall watching the draft was a lot of fun. So it was fun getting into it.
I think the highlight for me, aside from, the picks that our teams had, was Shedeur falling all the way down as far as he did. And just hearing about all the reasons why, people speculating this or that, and then ultimately the reports coming out that, he had terrible interviews. And, a lot of the things that he said, it felt unserious. And in a lot of ways, I think that kind of rubbed a lot of these teams the wrong way. So I was interested to see how he felt like that. I didn't think he'd be round one. I wasn't too surprised that he fell out of round one.
Same.
But when he was still not drafted in round two, and I was like, oh, okay, this is going pretty far. It was farther than I expected for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're the NFL, I think, at the end of the day, I think they were okay with it. You get Shedeur Sanders, you get to milk that story for 3 straight days and just let that go. When is Shedeur finally going off? And then, it doesn't matter whether he was a first round pick or a 5th round pick, he still gets the same level of attention. But no, it was a pretty interesting draft full of a lot of interesting moves, our own teams included. So let's start with the Philadelphia Eagles. Let's start off with the first pick. I'm going to pull up everyone here. So the Eagles traded up from this pick. We went from pick 32 and traded one of our 5th round picks to move up one pick to swap with Kansas City. And we moved up to grab Jahad Campbell, the linebacker / edge out of Alabama. And a couple reasons why this pick was, I want to say, surprising because, obviously when we did the the mock drafts and everything like that, for guys that I was thinking about that were going to be there for trading up that I wanted, there was the Walter Nolans, the Malachi Starks, Jalen Walker. I was like, okay, maybe if one of these guys are falling, we'll be okay. And then the last domino that dropped was Malachi going to Baltimore. And I was like, okay, now let's just take a look at who's here. And now the question was, were the Eagles actually going to trade up or trade back in this spot? Were they going to make a pick? And they ended up trading with Kansas City. And Ben, you hit me up right away. You're like, oh, who are they going to trade for? Shedeur or anything like that. I'm just kidding. But there was a bunch of names. There was a bunch of options on the board. And Jahad Campbell was one of them. And, we had talked about Jahad Campbell a little bit, mainly as a target for the Niners, because
Mm-hmm.
throughout this entire draft process, he was mocked as a top 12, top 10 player. And, for this is classic Eagles, somehow stumbling upon a guy who falls to the end of the first and the Eagles pick up a stud. And, Jahad Campbell, 6'2", 235 pounds, ran a 4.5, 4.5, 240 at the combine with a torn labrum, I might add you. So he did a bunch of workouts and just looked like he looked great. But the reason he fell was injury concerns, and he has legitimate injury concerns, which may prevent him from being on the field week 1. There's mixed reports on, he'll be ready, or will he be ready? That's always going to be the case. And the odds are there's a chance that he's not going to be on there. He just got surgery for the torn labrum. He had two knee surgeries he had to get done, and he had another surgery on his shoulder as well. So definitely something to monitor. But Howie Roseman came out and said that this was, his injury concern is not a concern for the team long term. And they're really excited to get him. He was a top 10 player on their board. He's just an elite athlete who just moves so fluidly, the way that, when you watch a guy like Fred Warner play and how graceful but at the same time just quick he is to get to the ball in pursuit. This is what Jahad Campbell can do. And now the discussion in Philadelphia regarding Jahad Campbell is the discussion on whether he's actually going to play off-ball linebacker, which is what he dominated in Alabama, or there has been conversations about having him play on the edge as an edge rusher. And sounds a little bit, far-fetched, but when I offer you a comp from 2 years ago when we were drafted Nolan Smith, he was 6'3", 238. So Jahad Campbell right around there for when you enter the NFL draft. And obviously we saw how Nolan Smith really impacted this team at the end of last year when he really kind of blossomed into that, significant edge. So when Howie was talking about Jahad, it was like, we really like what he can do. We have an idea for him off the edge. We have an idea. He kept referencing his edge history because when he entered college, he was an edge rusher when he entered Alabama, but Alabama had studs. They had like Will McDonald, Dallas Turner. So he kind of got lost in the fold, and they moved him over to linebacker, and he really flourished. So, there's going to be a lot of interesting things about this pick, but Jahad Campbell's a Philly native. His whole family loves Philadelphia Eagles. He grew up watching the Eagles. You get a guy who's extremely, personable. He seems passionate. He has a great energy to him. And you're getting a guy who is a potential top 10 pick, top 10 talent at 31. I don't see how you could go wrong with this pick, especially because he, this team is in a spot where, yes, we still need him to contribute once he's on the field, but we don't need him on the field right away. So I thought this was a great, medium risk, high reward pick for getting Jahad Campbell.
Yeah, I was surprised by the pick when it happened. Obviously, this was one of our guys that we talked about, but from that Niners perspective. But the biggest thing that surprised me was it's been 46 years since the Eagles drafted a linebacker in the first round like that, and they broke that curse, for lack of a better word here. But taking Jahad at this place it's not, like you said, it's not a crazy risk or anything like that. He has a high floor. His ceiling is to be decided. And in an organization like Philadelphia, I think that ceiling can absolutely be boosted as opposed to going to other teams around the league. Taking reps at edge rusher versus his linebacker presence, that's the only questions right now. Because from an edge perspective, it's been talked about how he just doesn't have any elite techniques on the edge. And that's something that they need to develop. And I mean, obviously, you're in a good spot. Like I just mentioned, you're in a good spot to learn those techniques. And what's nice too is the team is in a good spot where you guys don't need him to be a high value piece right now. He can be a bit of a project player and somebody that you rely on, 2-3 years from now to really find his own. And if that's on the edge, if it's at linebacker, if it's a mix of both, hell yeah, it's gonna be awesome. So great pick.
Absolutely. And yeah, he's still on the younger side, which is nice. I do think I agree with you in terms of he's definitely not when you watch the film, he's not the most natural pass rusher because of the time he spent on off-ball linebacker since he converted. But, he only had 99 pass rush snaps last year, but he generated 20 pressures on those. So the potential as him as an athlete is there. And I think when you get him in Vic Fangio's system, not only can you, you could operate him off the edge, but you can treat him like Zach Bond in the sense that you can rush him off the edge or you can play him in the middle of the field, and he's excellent in coverage. So that's, you get a guy who can do it all, and you all of a sudden have multiple chess pieces you can move around if you want to attack Bond off the edge. And you can, like, Nakobe Dean gets healthy, you can have Dean and Campbell up here, Campbell on one side and Bond on the other. Like, there's a lot of versatility that this pick brings. So definitely super excited to see what happens. The ceiling of this draft class, when we talk about it, will be reliant upon the success of Jahad Campbell if he ends up being the player that we hope he is. But I think even with that, I think that this pick alone made it worth it. To get a guy who just loves the Eagles and wants to play here is always such a huge thing. So definitely wanted to talk about him in length because he was the crown jewel of our draft, and he's definitely going to be the name that we pay attention to the most, going into the season.
I will say the one thing that does kind of make me nervous, and hopefully it pans out, is that injury history. And I know you brought that up, but it's lengthy, bro. Like it goes back a ways, and he's seen some pretty nasty injuries, and especially coming off this one right now. I mean, the questions of being available week 1, no problem. Take your time, rest up, do what you need to. But reliability from a standpoint of availability is going to be massive in a few years when who knows what this team looks like and how big of a role that Jahad's gonna have. So that's the one thing to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. So we move on to our second round pick. The Eagles traded out, made a few moves in the mid rounds here. So they ended up with pick 64, and with that pick, they went with safety Andrew Makuba out of Texas. And this one shocked me in the sense of, I do think in terms of all the prospects we talk about here, when we talk about, you and I are about to go on a nice little rant here regarding consensus boards among draft, analysts and all the mock, consensus big boards, all that fun stuff. Makuba in this spot for the Eagles is a bit of a reach, because when you think of, he was the third safety taken off the board, Emanwari and Starks were both gone. And there was other options that were available, Kevin Winston, and I know that just to name one, that were ranked higher during this process. But then when you look at Makuba and the skill set he brings, when you think about Vic Fangio and you think about, guys that we lost, and I talked about safety being a big need, and CJ Gardner-Johnson played a huge role. Well, if you want to copy and paste a CJ Gardner-Johnson type of player, this is exactly who Andrew Makuba is. And he's 5'11", 185. He's only 10 pounds lighter than CJ, and the same height. So when you want to talk about, like, oh yes, he's an undersized dude, yeah, but he plays above his weight. He plays aggressive. He can contest with tight ends, and he is very instinctual and has the athleticism to make a play on the dime. He had 5 interceptions last year at Texas, was extremely productive and made big plays. And you really saw the way that he can read the field, and his instincts alone really help him. And I think that he can be trusted with the intricacies of Vic Fangio's defense. And I think that he's just a nice plug and play piece. He will be given the opportunity to start right away. I do think, Sidney Brown and him will probably be competing for that other spot unless the Eagles bring in a veteran. That option is still totally on the table if they want to go invest in Justin Simmons or Julian Blackmon in the meantime. But Makuba was the pick here. I wasn't as excited about it at first, but when I watched this film, I understand why the Eagles did what they did, because CJ was an awesome tackler when he landed hits, but he also, as an undersized guy, did get beat every now and again when he was the last line of defense. So I do anticipate a little bit of that from Makuba, but if we're looking for a ball hawk, he's the guy. So I was happy with this pick after I got to step back and watch some film on him.
Yeah, the only downsides to him is he's small. He does run risks of injuries, missed tackles, like you said, etc. But I'm not sure if you saw what Howie said. He told reporters Friday night after the draft. He said it's really hard to find cover safeties, guys who have the ability to come down and play over the slot, play in the middle of the field, have natural instincts, play the ball. He was a slot corner at Clemson before he transferred to Texas. He plays with a mentality. He plays on an Eagles brand of football. I think for us, the value fit the need. through the process, this guy just checked all the boxes. That was really what we were looking for at that position. And I think that really stands out, when we talk about the consensus kind of thing here. Yeah, you absolutely could have found him in round 3. But the Eagles knew at this pick, they knew that they going into this draft, they needed to fill that safety position and that slot corner position, which, CJ Gardner-Johnson commanded. And obviously with his departure, that was an open slot. And who knows if he would have been available based on how the board was falling and based on how rounds 2 through everything else go, right? So taking your guy when you have him available, I think this was a high value pick for the Eagles, and I think that this is overall a pretty good pick. I would say it's like a B overall, B plus.
Absolutely. And that's the thing when you think about this draft, the Eagles, I think with their first 3 picks got players who they Howie talked about this. He's like, day one, you want to find a star. You want to find a Pro Bowl caliber player. You want to find someone who is a regular part of your core. And your second pick, he's like, you want a solid starter. You want someone who can come in on day one and do the job that is asked of him. And they believe that Makuba can be this guy. So I am excited. I'm really excited to see him get to work. I like the idea of just having that CJ replacement who's younger and, so if he's as, intelligent as they say he is on the field, I'm really excited to see, just how often he's around the ball. So he seems like he has a good personality to him too. He played with Jeremiah Trotter Jr. when he was in Clemson. And yeah, he does have some slot experience, but he definitely shined the most as a safety. So I think that's what they like him for, a little bit of versatility. And, yes, he's undersized, but you're not going to see that on the field. So I think we're really excited about him. So we move on to the third pick, which actually happened in round 4. The Eagles traded out of their third round pick. I guess they didn't see there were plenty of guys in this area that were available. And we'll talk about kind of the direction our teams kind of went and what that means. But there was a few guys in certain positions where I was like, oh man, like I'd be good taking one of them in the 3rd round. The Eagles didn't feel that way, so they waited until day 3. And so we go to round 4, pick 111. The Eagles went with Ty Robinson, defensive tackle out of Nebraska. Dude's a freaking monster if you look at him. Now, he's 6'5", 288 pounds. The 288 for a defensive tackle isn't as much, but it's his height, it's his freak athleticism. He tested as one of the best defensive tackles for relative athletic score ever in NFL history. I think he was like 40th out of 2,500 that they had. So this dude is like a one-of-a-kind athlete for his size and his build. I will say, when we talk about the negatives on this guy, he is an older prospect. He is a 6-year senior. He's 24 years old. But and you could tell that his production kind of matches that storyline too. As he got older, he was much more productive. Last year was kind of his breakout year, but you could kind of tell he was a 24-year-old playing amongst 20 to 22-year-olds. So it definitely, he benefited from that, but he fits kind of the mold of what the Eagles are looking for in terms of a Milton Williams replacement. He had 37 total pressures last year, and he's, again, freak athlete, plays with a high motor, and he's super intense. He's definitely not afraid to get chippy, so he's going to bring an attitude and an intensity that I think when you talk about this rotation, this defensive tackle rotation, you're feeling pretty good about it. Jordan Davis just signed. The Eagles just picked up his 5th-year option. So you have Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Moro Ujima, and then Ty Robinson. You're feeling pretty good at that 4 if you're rotating those guys around for different reasons whatsoever. So I'm feeling pretty good about the Ty Robinson pick.
Yeah, dude, he's a monster. He's versatile. You can move him all over the D line. He's that powerful player. 7 sacks in 2024, 10 batted passes over the last 2 seasons. He just ends up smoking guys at the line of scrimmage. This is a really good pick. I was a bit surprised to see him slide the way he did. But
exactly.
If a player is going to slide, they always slide to the Eagles. So it was the perfect spot for him. So really, really solid pick.
Yeah, I think that there was a fun stat Elliot Short Parks from the Go Birds podcast found out regarding Ty Robinson. He played 8 snaps at fullback for Nebraska during this career, and they scored on 7 of those 8 plays where he took a snap at fullback, and he never touched the ball. He was always the guy blocking and setting the path. So I thought that was interesting too. So maybe we see a Ty Robinson tush push or something like that off the gut or something. But so I definitely like this pickup. I think when we talk about the first 3 picks, I was really, really happy with the guys we ended up So definitely happy with Ty Robinson. Then we move on to round 5, and the Eagles lived in round 5 and round 6 in this draft. So the first, I would say, after watching film, I'm much more high on this guy now than I was when we originally drafted him. I didn't really know who this guy was. Again, you're talking about day 3 guys. You don't study everybody. But the Eagles went with round 5, pick 145, Mac McWilliams, the cornerback out of UCF. Now, I've talked about corner in this draft. I was like, oh yeah, we could totally use another outside corner. One with good size. This guy does not have good size. He's 5'10, 191 pounds, so definitely on the smaller side. And in college, he played predominantly on the outside. Um, Now, what that means is he's tough. He's extremely twitchy. He's good. He's connected on the ball. One thing I really liked about him is he was one of those players invited to the Senior Bowl. And when they did one-on-one matchups with him and he was going up against day 1, day 2 guys, he won every single time. He was sticky. He played bigger than his size. So when you imagine, okay, if Keeley goes down, if Adoree Jackson goes down, oh man, who else can we put on the outside? You could, at the end of the day, feel comfortable putting Mac McWilliams out there. So I still need to study a little bit of his film. Obviously, he's a small guy, so that you wonder how he's going to be in the run defense and everything like that. But everything I hear is that he's a super tough guy. So you know what? We can develop him as a backup for DeJean in the slot, or maybe even a special teams guy for sure. So I like the pick. I didn't know too much about him going in, but after watching some film, I like the idea of having him here.
Yeah, and he's feisty and good against the run. That speed is going to be key and something to kind of see how he uses that when it comes to the NFL level. But ultimately, yeah, it was a bit of an interesting pick. I didn't expect this one, but ultimately, I think it should pan out, especially considering the secondary room that you guys are building right now.
Exactly. So then we move on to round 5, pick 161. This one was actually a cool pick. I was pretty excited about getting this guy. We went with another linebacker. His name is Smile Mondon Jr. from Georgia. And I think the reason I really like this pick for this spot is he's, again, another uber athletic guy. He's a little undersized for a linebacker. He's 6'2", 224, but this guy's kind of played all over the place. He's played a little bit of safety. He's played linebacker, and he's played some time in the slot in his career. So he is awesome in coverage, and he can go sideline to sideline with anybody, and is extremely good in run pursuit. So I think if we're not starting Jahad Campbell right away and Nakobe Dean's still hurt, there is a real possibility this guy may challenge for some starting minutes right away. He's instinctual, is extremely smart. That Georgia defense is a really intricate defense that Kirby Smart runs. So he's really aware of complicated systems and being able to make adjustments on the fly. So I really like this pick, taking a flyer on this guy. The only concern, like a few of these other guys, is he did have some injuries and he definitely had some trouble staying on the field. So if he can manage that in the NFL, he's a solid pick.
Yeah, and that's going to be the thing to keep an eye on. But it's building that depth right now, and that's kind of key for an already Super Bowl built roster. So
exactly,
it was a solid pick.
So then we move on to pick 168 in still the 5th round. We went with center Drew Kendall from Boston College. He's 6'4", 308 pounds. His dad has 13. His dad played in the NFL for 13 years. His name is Pete Kendall. Played for the Seahawks, the Cardinals, a lot of Niners rivals. He only allowed 1 sack last year. He has good footwork and athleticism. He has good size for a center at 6'4", but then if you move him around the line, he's kind of undersized. But he has good footwork. He has that familial experience playing the sport, so he grew up around it. And he definitely fits the mold of what you want for a Jeff Stoutland offensive lineman. And I'm going to talk about 2 more offensive linemen in this next little stretch here, and it's basically the same thing. We're enrolling them into Jeff Stoutland universities, hoping that he can take these balls of clay and really mold them into something. But you take a flyer. We didn't take any offensive linemen at all until this point in the draft, so we wait till round 5 to get our first guy on the board. And I think the Eagles felt like they could take some dart throws at a lot of these offensive linemen in the draft, and I thought he was a good one to start. And then we'll book on. So we're gonna run through these later picks here. The next interesting pick was round 6, pick 181. We went with Kyle McCord, the quarterback out of Syracuse. He led the NCAA with almost 4,800 passing yards. It was an ACC record. He's from Philadelphia as well. He played at St. Joe's Prep, one of the prep schools in Philadelphia. And the Eagles are, this isn't surprising. McCord is one of those picks where it's like you can kind of, given this quarterback class, he was kind of a luxury pick given some of the quarterbacks that were off the board. Kyle McCord, has good experience. He played at big colleges, not just Syracuse, but Ohio State. Like he's an experienced player, and he definitely has a good instinct to him. When you talk about the Eagles, we got rid of Kenny Pickett. It's Tanner McKee, and we had Dorian Thompson-Robinson. But McCord can come in and just take that third QB spot, and the Eagles can continue to be a self-called QB factory and, potentially flip him for a pick or something later on. But I think this is a good insurance pick to have for sure. And then we move on to pick 191. So we went with Miles Hinton, the tackle out of Michigan. This dude's a monster of a player. 6'7", 334 pounds. His father, Chris Hinton, also played 13 years in the NFL. So you get another player whose father played in the NFL in the same spot. You definitely he has the size and traits for Jeff Stoutland to mold him into a stud. He's raw, but there has been parts of his film where he's shown just complete dominance. So if he hits, he's our backup swing tackle from day one. But definitely a guy that, you can build upon. And then the next pick I want to talk about, when we talk about consensus, this was the guy that everyone felt like the Eagles were like, whoa, like they got a major steal and that no one's talking about. And this is in pick 207 in round 6. They went with tackle Cameron Williams from Texas. And I think the reason, I had no clue who this guy was going into this, but people were the mock drafters, the guys who study this, who love this stuff, said that if Cameron Williams, he's a young guy, he's still a junior, if he stayed in Texas another year, there was legitimate talks of him being a first-round prospect next year from the tackle position, and the fact that the Eagles were able to get him in round 6 this year because he is a raw product. He was one of the more penalized players. This was his first full year at right tackle. But then you see all the athletic traits, and he's, again, just one of these athletic freaks, 6'6", 317 pounds. His hands are, mammoth size. Like, he is, when you talk about displacement in the offensive line, a guy who can just move another man against his will, that's what this guy can do. So, as a project player, he gets to just sit back and study behind Lane Johnson. We might have just found our heir apparent. That's how hyped up this guy's getting. So, he will be a name that I'm monitoring for a 6th-round pick. He's gotten a lot of hype for sure. And then I want to move on to our final pick that we made, and that was pick 209 in round 6, and his name is Antoine Powell-Ryland, the edge rusher from Virginia Tech. Now, when we talk about the slew of edge rushers that went in this draft, you got the Mike Greens, the Donovan Ezrakus. When we talk about the leaders in sacks, Antoine Powell-Ryland in the past 2 seasons led the FBS in sacks with 25 and a half sacks over the past 2 seasons. If there's one thing this dude knows how to do is get to the quarterback. And I thought for this pick, in round 6, the fact that this guy fell was really interesting. When you watch his film, he's a pass rusher. Like, you can just see he has a lot of techniques. He has counter moves. Like, he goes into each pass rush prepared with a plan and a backup plan, which is what you don't see from a lot of these, high trait guys that we get early on in the early rounds. This guy is has proven production. The thing with him is they said that he's undersized in terms of his arm length specifically, and they say that they're worried that in the NFL, longer tackles are going to be able to make the initial contact more often than not, which would get in his way a little bit. So I do think that maybe that gets in the way, but this dude has pass rushing moves, and they might have just taken a flyer on a dude who, could actually be a 3rd down pass rush specialist. And if that's who you're getting in round 6, somebody who can, play 15 or, 20 third downs each week, I'm happy with that. So this was the draft class for the Philadelphia Eagles. We talk about, after every draft, there's a lot of undrafted names. We are not going to go through all those. There are going to be some we can talk about in the coming weeks that, make some noise that are going to be interesting. But when I look at this Eagles draft, I feel pretty good about it. There was a lot of good that came from it. When we talk about takeaways, me personally, first takeaway I got right away, this was a Vic Fangio and Jeff Stoutland draft. the Eagles said, "Hey, Vic, none of our offensive linemen are falling to us early that we want. We're going defense. Who are you feeling? Who are the guys that you were wanting the most? We're going to retool this defense because that's the spot where we lost all of our talent. So let's refresh with guys that that you believe that we can build." And that's why some of these picks were like, okay, these are, interesting fits, but this has Vic Fangio's name written all over it. And then the second was the Eagles didn't trade or draft a tight end at all in this draft. And that was one of the main topics was, oh, are the Eagles going to flip Goddard for maybe a pick and then draft the heir apparent? Or are they going to make a trade? And that still remains to be seen. But the Eagles, have continuously said, we love Dallas Goddard. We want to try and have him on the team. They never, they're not saying anything officially, but they kind of have said that, if they can try and make it work with Goddard, then they will. But there's still the option of, trading him, or, Michael Mayer has been a name from the Raiders that's been talked about a lot as a potential trade candidate to come over here. But those were kind of the main takeaways for me in this draft is, okay, we didn't come away with an air tight end like I thought we were going to. We didn't, we took the dart throws on the O-line late in the draft, and those looked like good picks at the time. So we'll see if they can develop them. So I'm not mad at that. And they really focused defense early and often in this draft. And I think that was the right move. I think they did exactly what they needed to do to replenish and retool to go ahead and try to defend a Super Bowl run.
Yeah, I think that's a solid analysis. This was one of those drafts where I think the Eagles added some really good pieces. There weren't any splash moves. You can kind of make an argument and say that Jahad Campbell's kind of a splash move, but obviously that depends, right?
Right.
But 10 players, 6 defense, same deal as the Niners. The first 5 picks were defense. And the biggest thing, in my opinion, is you retain the draft capital for next year as well. So, Marcos, if you had to give a grade for this draft, what do you think you would give it?
Coming off of, after reviewing all the players and just kind of thinking of, taking positional value into effect, what we really needed, I would give this draft a solid, I would say A-. And it's not a perfect draft by any means. I thought we could have done some different things with different picks, but if this class hits the way we expect it to, at least within the top 3 or 4 picks that we had, and one of these dart throws hit, we're feeling really confident. And this turns into an A+ if Jahad Campbell hits. This could go all the way down to at least a B if Jahad Campbell doesn't. But I do think I think the Eagles, the goal from this draft was to find at least 1 or 2 quality starters that you can throw into this defense at least, and keep things going. And when I feel really good coming out of this draft, because when I'm looking through the depth chart now, and I'm like, there really isn't the same levels of holes that we had going into it. I do think that we got better from the draft, which was good, which is a good feeling to have. I don't have as many questions as we did, and we're feeling good going into the next stretch of free agency, to where let's let camp play out. Let's see how these players look. And if someone isn't looking the way that we think they are, then we'll get a new face in the building. But I think the Eagles have kind of signaled, hey, where moves can still be made, but we're going to be patient with it. We're not going to rush. We feel good with where we're at. So they feel good. I feel good. It is an A-. Nothing to complain about. There's a potential star in the building. So, the vibes are up in Philly and we're feeling good.
Fire, dude.
All right. So that's enough for the Eagles. It's time to talk about the Niners. Before we get into the Niners draft of it all, there was some big news, and definitely some news. We talked about, multiple contracts and how this happens, but Ben, the Niners signed a very important player in the month that starts with an A, but it wasn't August. It was April. Crazy, dude. So
I know.
Lay the news on us. Tell us what's going on.
No, I'm still, like, if you look at my hand, I'm still shaking because it doesn't feel real that the Niners actually got a deal done in the middle of April, or rather at the end of April, but they did. George Kittle signed for 4 years, $76.4 million contract extension with the 49ers. The annual average is $19.1 million in new money. So, this will make George Kittle the highest paid tight end in the NFL. And there's, obviously the benefit to waiting and being the second player, of the offseason to get that deal. Obviously, Trey McBride of Arizona was recently made the highest paid, and George Kittle just one upped him, as he rightfully should. Because if I'm being fully honest with you, George Kittle is the best tight end, all around tight end in the NFL. So to get him at the price that we did, you can say, well, it's top end money. Look at the Niners putting themselves in debt. $76.4 million for 4 years of George Kittle. I'll take that any day. This is a great move. The tight end market is not out of hand. It's not like wide receivers. And you're getting wide receiver type production out of George Kittle. On top of that, you're getting one of the best blockers, not just, on our team, but one of the better blockers in the league. So from a utility standpoint, the 49ers are kind of set at the tight end position. Now they just need to get that, get some more of that depth, which they have worked on throughout the offseason. But super hyped. George Kittle is here to stay. He's going to be a Niner for probably the rest of his career, and I'm super stoked about that. So what were your thoughts on it?
No, you always love to keep a player, that's had the impact that Kittle has had, for their entire career if possible. I think that, he's one of the faces of the franchise. When you think about, the past decade of the 49ers, you really just think of George Kittle as that kind of face that really started the era of the successful Niners. Always, I don't care whether I'm not a fan of the Niners. I'm a fan of George Kittle. As a person, he's one of those people you love to get the mic'd up on. He's just an interesting guy. No, and then, I know the Niners do that thing where they have the Ring of Honor. You hit the 10 years, so then you hit the wall type thing. So I think if there's he's one of the few special players that definitely deserves that right, and he's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer when it's all said and done. So for him to kind of, it's rare. It's just rare to see nowadays. You have a rare player who's starting and ending his career on the Niners. So I think that's really cool. So super happy for you guys. I think that was awesome for him.
Yeah, exactly. And he's one of my favorite players personally. So, to be able to get that news in April and not have to wait all off season, it's a pretty good feeling. So stoked about that. Let's move on to the last bit of news here before we break into to the draft picks. Marcos, the Niners, they may not have drafted offensive line, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but they did sign former Pro Bowl offensive tackle DJ Humphries from the Kansas City Chiefs. Humphries is a first round pick in 2015. He was drafted to the Cardinals. He started 98 games in 8 seasons before tearing his ACL and forcing Arizona to fold on their former first rounder. He landed with the Chiefs, where he eventually suffered a hamstring injury, putting him out until about week 18. So the 2 games that he played for the Chiefs, he was trash. I mean, to be honest with you, he was not good. But I think a lot of that has to do with not being in game shape. We talked about game shape with Brandon Ayuk all last season, right? And not seeing the field a lot, I think will play a major factor. So then when you play those 2 games, you're probably not going to be on top of your game. He'll likely provide depth at the top tackle position. As far as starting right away, obviously his best shot is going to be on the right side, which he hasn't played since 2016. So some questions there in terms of, what kind of where he's going to be utilized most. He might just be a depth piece behind Trent Williams, which personally I would envision him as being, because I think he's probably better than Colton McKivitz right now, who's obviously our right side tackle. But it's something that maybe discussion or the training or training camp questions are answered at that point, right? So we'll see what this provides, but nonetheless, it is some offensive tackle depth that the 49ers desperately needed to add.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you something about, the Kittle contract too, just to circle back real quick. How now that now that the Niners handled this contract, we kind of always thought it was going to be Brock Purdy starts everything, and then,
Mm-hmm.
Kittle, and then Warner falls suit. But does that give you a good feeling with the Kittle contract being done? Does that make you feel even better knowing like, oh, there's no way they don't have Brock's, in the works, ready to go in a good spot because you're hearing the good news from George Kittle?
Yeah, I mean, it's always good to sign a player, just in general, and have those negotiations come to an end in a good way earlier rather than later. It helps a lot with the further negotiations that you have to make. And so when you're making a tough negotiation, like signing a quarterback to an extension, it it just kind of, you get that kind of weight off your shoulders knowing that you don't have another one right after it. And from everything that I've been hearing with the Brock conversation, contract negotiations are progressing well. Things are going well. The dollar amount is expected where you and I kind of anticipated that, between the 50-55 million. The most recent was about 50-52, but I'm really confident that the Niners can get this deal done with Brock earlier rather than later, because both parties are willing to make that happen. You know, that was one of the conversations we talked about last year with Brandon Ayuk. Both parties weren't 100% in it at the same time. You know, Brandon Ayuk wasn't invested in getting a deal done when the Niners were. And then it flipped. You know, the Niners weren't necessarily invested when Brandon Ayuk was. And then at the very last second, you know, all alarms, you know, sound the alarms. This is happening now. And it was a disaster, right? So to have a player who wants to get this deal done, who wants to be a 49er, wants to establish a career, you know, with our franchise, and then vice versa for the 49ers to acknowledge that they have a quarterback that they want to invest their future and obviously a large portion of their money into, I think negotiations are going to go very well, and I think this deal will get done soon.
Heck yeah. No, and I was feeling the same thing. I do think though, and we'll talk about, post draft, and everything like that, but I do think, when we talk about the conversation we were having about our teams, a year ago today, I think the vibes around both of our franchises were in a completely different spot. And the vibes, especially for the 49ers, like you said, were very chaotic. And I think this year they've definitely made an effort. It's been chaotic in terms of all these players that have gone. But I do think for the ones that are here and for the ones they're trying to build around, they made that effort to be less chaotic and actually approach it much more appropriately and rewarding players and rewarding the guys that they should. So I do think that it sets them up. I think the vibes around everything I'm hearing about the Niners is that the vibes are up. Things are looking, feeling good. It's like a refreshing, restart.
It is, and that's exactly the word, is refreshing. This was the offseason the Niners kind of had to have and continue to need to have as it progresses, because last year was rough, and obviously you're coming off the Super Bowl loss, prior to, and there was a lot of questions going into the offseason. There's still questions to be answered, but as far as the chaos with the mass exodus that we saw for the free agents, that kind of thing is over and done with. What the Niners have been doing in terms of building their team hasn't been chaotic, and it's been very organized, and it's had a lot of fluidity to it. So it's flowed well. This offseason has brought a lot of good good topics of conversation, and obviously some good feelings as well. So another thing that gives the good feelings is the draft, and I'm going to talk about this right now. So let me summarize real quick. The Niners were the furthest off of consensus in the NFL draft per PFF, meaning they took the most overvalued players. So essentially they drafted guys that you could have found later, in the draft. So they took them too early.
They reached for them.
Yeah. Now, consensus is something that, oh God, man, I've heard this now 50, maybe 60 times in the past, 5 days. I think it's a load of BS. I get it. I totally get it. But when you value a player, when you have your eyes set on a certain player and you anticipate things to shift and you not to get, land your player, I understand why you would make these selections. And a lot of these guys that the 49ers took, it wasn't just like a kind of a last minute thing. My understanding was they had their eyes on them. They had absolutely had them circled for some time being. The 49ers absolutely did get sniped in this one multiple times. They got sniped in this draft, especially in the early to middle rounds. But the Niners, they prioritized run stopping and defensive line. And that was kind of the highlight for me. They took all the defensive players the Niners have are awesome against the run now. So, good luck running the football against the 49ers this year. And we're going to talk about that because they got some absolute beasts in terms of stopping the run. But I was surprised the Niners used all 11 picks. The Niners went 5 defensive picks with their first 5 picks. Last time they did that was in 1981. Fun little nugget here per Matt Mayoko. when they won their first Super Bowl. That was back in 1981. That's when they also took their first 5 picks being defensive picks. Those picks were Ronnie Lott, John Hardy, Eric Wright, Carlton Williamson, and Lynn Thomas. So fun little, nugget there. I think we're going to win the Super Bowl this year is what that tells me. But no offensive line until round 7, Marcos. And you and I had this conversation, a number of weeks now about one of the priorities of the draft for the 49ers should have been the offensive line. And I absolutely believe it was. I think a lot of the snipes that we saw from the 49ers was offensive linemen. Like the Raiders, for instance, they traded up and took pick 98 and 99. They took 2 offensive linemen. And that was right before the Niners at 100. So I fully believe the 49ers were going to take one of those 2 offensive linemen. So that's just kind of an example of why I kind of believe there was some sniping that happened specifically with the offensive line. But I'm not mad. I'm not super mad at why we didn't address the O-line as much. And the biggest reason being, and I didn't realize this is also per PFF, pass blocking for the 49ers is 11th in the NFL last year. And that takes into account the 7 games with no Trent Williams. I can live with 11th in the NFL if that's true too. Their run blocking was 3rd in the NFL. So this, the 11th and 3rd, obviously, in all, they're a very middle of the pack offensive line. You absolutely want to see them improve it, but it's not the end of the world for me to see them not, draft the offensive lineman that we had our eyes on for a number of, weeks and months now. I think you're going to be able to find depth pieces. You're going to be able to find these undrafted guys that you and I are not going to talk about right now. So ultimately, really solid draft. Let's get into round 1, 11th overall pick. My guy and the 49ers guy, Mykel Williams out of Georgia. Marcos, this was my mock draft guy that I have my eyes on. I loved what I saw from him. And the 49ers also love what they saw from him in college, so much that they actually tried to trade up as far as 8th in the draft with the Carolina Panthers to get him because they didn't anticipate Mykel falling that far back to 11. Now, that is concerning, and full transparency, I think that in the Lynch and Shanahan era and Jed York, they have misinterpreted and kind of had the wrong idea of how this draft would play out at times. And I think this was absolutely a prime example. But what a beautiful day. The 49ers didn't have to trade up and they got their guy at 11. So, over his collegiate career, he totaled 67 tackles, 21 and a half tackles for loss, and 14 sacks. He's 6'5", 260 pounds. And what do you get immediately? Elite edge run defense. He has an explosive first step, a quick change of direction, and powerful finishing. He's a young, smart, and hungry athlete. His athleticism and immediate production will make him a very strong addition to the Robert Saleh-led defense. And as I talk about the rest of these picks, Marcos, especially these, first 5, it has Robert Saleh written all over it. Because if we flash back to the last time he was coordinator here, what was the most important thing to Robert Saleh and the 49ers on defense? It was building that line. Having that defensive line do a majority of the work, and if anything slips through, well, you've got your legendary linebackers back there to make the stop. And if anything gets past there, you've got a decent cornerback safety room that can make a play. So I was thrilled to see them kind of go defensive line in this draft. So what were your thoughts on pick 11, Mykel Williams?
I was really excited because, like last year when I had my guys, the Quignons, the Cooper, we ended up with them. I was like so excited. So I can only imagine how this feels when you did your draft process and you were like, I really like this guy. And then they ended up drafting him. So, Mykel Williams has all the traits that you really like. He's super young. That's something that you get excited about because he has that pro ready body, but he's so young. So the development, you can imagine, is only going to get better. And then for those who want to argue last year about his production, dude was playing with an ankle injury all of last year. So, take that with what you want. Playing injured is how healthy is he really? But it does emphasize his toughness a bit, that he was still able to be productive while dealing with an injury. So imagine him at full strength. Imagine him at full speed. I really like Michael Williams for this pick. I think at this spot, like you said, there was a lot of guys on the board. Because the board kind of went a little differently than anticipated
Mm-hmm.
in that top 10. So you guys had the weird options available. Tyler Warren was available. You guys could have gotten weird and cute with it. You went with the smart, you know, young pick. I think when we talk about consensus, I think when we talk about the Niners draft, I think if there was one thing everybody really agreed on was that not trading up and just taking Michael Williams at 11 was the right move for the Niners moving forward. So yeah, awesome pick. I loved it.
For sure. So moving on, round 2, pick 43. The 49ers draft Alfred Collins, defensive lineman out of Texas. Collins played 5 seasons with the Longhorns. He was a consistent presence on one of the best defensive lines in college football. The Bills traded up at 41 to get TJ Sanders. I think the Niners would have drafted him at 43 if he was there, but probably a snipe there. What you get with Collins is a big body at 6'5", 330 pounds. Not sure that he was the right pick at 43, but I'm happy with it because he's great at at batting down passes. He had 6 last year. I don't think he's a 3-down player in the NFL just yet, but he totaled 142 tackles, 18 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks across 63 games with 26 starts. So, he doesn't give ground. He doesn't really give ground when it comes to these tough O linemen, and that's something I'm going to kind of keep an eye on with him because he's got that big frame. So I'm curious to see if he's able to continue bullying the O linemen like he did throughout college. But Collins, he'll move people, but early weaknesses will show against teams who set edges and run outside zones. He probably can't keep up with a running back or with a play in general that goes past the line because obviously he's a big dude. And when you look at this guy, I mean, he's just an absolute tank. I have my doubts that he'll ever be a valuable pass rusher. So the hope at best is that he becomes just elite at run stopping, which is something that is definitely a priority in this draft and a priority for the Niners moving forward. So Marco's thoughts on Alfred Collins?
I think for if you guys want like a pro comp, I think the Eagles have one of their own Collins as well in Jordan Davis. I think if you want to talk about a guy, Jordan Davis has made some plays in the past, but the Eagles are always hoping that he would develop into a pass rusher. That just kind of has never been his niche, but he does take pride in being a run stuffer and clogging up lanes. And I do think with Collins is, thanks to Sala, he's going to have the opportunity to utilize his strengths. They're going to, what you got with Michael Williams and Alfred Collins is, hey, we can at least play these dudes on the first 2 downs. At the very least, if teams are going to try and run at us. I think the Niners are really taking a smart approach, going defensive linemen on the first 2 picks. And I agree with you that Collins might have been a little bit of a reach. I think when we talk about both of our teams, they both reached on some Texas boys here. But I do think that Collins makes sense for what the Niners were trying to do. Because people could argue Darius Alexander was still on the board. And I'm like, but again, that's not, the Niners aren't trying to improve their pass rush. They need to win on first and second down because they lost a lot of those defensively last year. So you get a guy like Collins, he can plug up the lanes right away. And yeah, if someone's going to round outside zone, maybe that's why you set him up next to Michael Williams. So I do think that's where I like the fact that they picked both. I do think if it was, if the Niners went a different direction round 1 and then went Collins round 2, then it would have been a little bit more like, you could have gotten a little bit more versatility in both spots. But because I think they covered both of their bases, I think this was a sound pick that made sense.
For sure. And like you said, like the priority was fixing that run defense, and that was a massive weakness for the 49ers last year. They were number 29th overall in run defense, which is just complete opposite of what the organization strives for. So to see them kind of go this route wasn't surprising. So moving on here, round 3, 75th overall pick, Niners took defensive lineman Nick Martin out of Oklahoma State. I like this pick. Again, probably taken a bit early. but it was probably a guy that they had their eyes on, and helps obviously with what we just talked about. Um, he's fast, his top end speed. He's got explosive bursts. He's he's kind of he's kind of small in a lot of ways. He's 5'11", 220. His film compared to a guy like Chris Paul Jr. Does look more like a Niners player from that standpoint. He gets downhill, hits hard. Led the team with 140 tackles, adding 30 pressures as a blitzer in 2023. And he was third in the country in tackles. So he missed some time in 2024. Might be why he slid so much, but Martin still managed 47 tackles and 7.5 tackles for loss in his final season. So he came in at about 170 on the PFF consensus board, since we want to talk about that. And obviously the Niners took them at the 75th pick. But again, the Niners are prioritizing building something that they were extremely weak on last year. And I think this is a really good pick to continue building that, building towards fixing that issue. So what were your thoughts?
I think when we talk about the whole consensus of it all too, I think Nick Martin makes a ton of sense for, like, in terms of like how he plays. He plays like a Niners player. This dude plays with his hair on fire. Like
Yeah.
I think that in college, like when in the NFL, when you adopt a player that plays with their hair on fire, that looks out of control in college, it's much easier to manage in a faster paced game like the NFL. I do think Martin's game is made a little bit more for the NFL. Um, was it a reach? Sure. Like, I completely understand that, but, nobody gave the Eagles crap for filling in positions, taking some flyers on guys on positions that they actually needed. And I do think that I've heard a lot about, Martin being compared to Dre Greenlaw in the sense of how he likes to just fly and he's quick and athletic. Um, and if that's the mold that the Niners wanted to go with, I don't blame them for taking their guy. And I agree. Yes, there were other options on the board at that position where you're like, they probably could have used this dude, but they obviously did the research on him, and I think I'm not going to crush them one way or the other. If this is the guy, I think he fits their scheme properly. Could they have gotten him later? Sure, but I do think that that was the route they took, and I can't hate on that pick. I think it's a good pick for what they're looking for.
No, that's a great point, because I was watching some of his highlights, because he wasn't really on one of my watch lists, obviously because I didn't expect to, be taking him up here at 75. But I watched his highlight reel, and yeah, you nailed it. He did remind me a lot of the flashes of Dre Greenlaw, just with how much he flies around from person to person, play to play. He's, it seems like he's on the end of so many plays, and that's something that the 49ers absolutely preach, and they want that kind of a presence in the building. And so this is absolutely a 49ers pick. I'm stoked about Nick Martin. I think he's gonna be really good for the team. I think he's, especially learning behind somebody like a Fred Warner, is only going to boost his experience and his ceiling, and even potentially his floor as it stands right now. So super solid pick.
Absolutely. All right, so we're starting to get into the later guys here. So
Yep.
I think there's one of them that I know for sure, but I don't want to say it yet. But I'll get hyped up. But I think the other guys I'm pretty unfamiliar with. So let's see what happens here.
For sure. So next pick was 100th overall. That was cornerback Upton Stout out of Western Kentucky. Probably the best value pick for the Niners on day two. Small even for nickelbacks, but he'll help with the run game. He's got a small frame, but he'll line up in slot and he'll take reps there. He didn't allow a touchdown as nearest defender in coverage the last 2 seasons, and that's probably something that stood out a lot to the 49ers. He has good speed, really good pursuit. Stays active in plays. My concerns really lie with his ability to tackle at an NFL level, considering his small frame. But he did have 21 bench press reps, so he's got some strength. He's got something cooking there. In 5 years, including time at North Texas, Stout tallied 166 tackles, 6 interceptions, including 1 pick six, 21 pass breakups, and 1 forced fumble. So dude is a ball hawk. He knows how to play. This was a solid pick at 100. Like I said, I think it was the best value pick for the Niners on day two. So cornerback Upton Stout, Marcos, what were you thinking?
Yeah, honestly, I had never heard of this dude. Obviously, coming from a smaller school, but I do think the Niners are a team that likes to utilize a lot of, positional versatility. And if they feel comfortable, if they want to throw the different look and maybe put Lenore on the outside and have Stout on the inside, the main concern is the size thing. But the production speaks for itself. He does seem like one of those players who plays bigger than his size.
Right.
And I do think it's so easy for when evaluating players, it's like, oh, he's a little short or he's a little underweight. Like, he probably can't do it. There's a reason they're even up for consideration here. There's a reason the Niners drafted him. He's an NFL caliber player. So, the question will be, you know, I don't think, especially with these guys from smaller schools, it is a little harder to justify some of these picks. So, Up and Stout, not too familiar, but the Niners, from what I were hearing, were very confident about having him in the system. So if that's the guy they feel good about, I'm cool with it for them. So when you talk about value picks at 100, that's where you can take dart throws where people would, be like, oh, this may be a little bit more questionable, but it's a day 3 guy. How much do these guys really care about that?
Yeah, exactly. So pick 113 overall. Niners once again take a defensive lineman in CJ West. And to be honest with you, Marcos, I think this might be my second favorite draft pick, just behind Michael Williams.
Yeah.
He's another big body. West, he played 5 collegiate seasons beginning at Kent State before transferring to Indiana for his final year. He appeared in 52 games of 46 starts, recording 152 tackles, 27 tackles for loss, 9 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and 2 passes defended. He's another run stopper. He's a monster on the run game. He penetrates the O-line and can blow plays up like the best of them. He was quoted right after his draft. He was quoted as saying, "I abuse centers, punch them in the face, and be as violent as possible." So he's an absolute dog. I love this pick for the Niners, and just everything I've seen from him, and obviously the things that I've heard from him. He feels like a Niners style player, and this is someone that I think will immediately provide you that depth on the defensive line and could easily be in the starting role very quickly if things pan out the way that I expect them to.
Yeah, I think when we want to evaluate, especially in the later rounds, when we talk about production, one thing you want to get with your defensive lineman is the tackles for loss. 27 tackles for losses. He's in the backfield. Like, this dude is a problem.
Massive.
So I do think that's, and based off of what he says, like, that's the kind of energy you want. You love that intensity, you love that motor. And I do think, like, that's an infectious personality to have. That high motor, that improves that entire line when he's next to, anybody. So I liked that pick. I think, when we talk about value, that actually might have been the best value for, what you're getting in that 4th round. It reminds me of Ty Robinson to the Eagles in terms of somebody who actually, you can see in the rotation right away for your squad. And you don't really, you feel like that even in limited snaps, if he's only seeing 20, 25 snaps, you'll be able to notice his impact out there. So I thought he was a great pick here for the Niners. I really liked him going into this.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a really good comparison. I love that. So I'm going to start moving a little bit quicker here. 138th overall, the 49ers took wide receiver Jordan Watkins out of Ole Miss. This pick was a bit surprising for me. I didn't know much about him when we drafted him. He had his breakout game. I looked at everything after. He had his breakout game in college against Arkansas, getting school records with 5 touchdown catches and 254 receiving yards on 8 receptions. The game was a blowout, Ole Miss winning like 63-31. Watkins' performance was also helped by Jackson Dart. So, just a little bit of the measurables. He's 5'11", 196 pounds. He's got 4.3 speed, so he ran a 4.3 40 dash. He's not super twitchy, probably best utilized outside and in spread in a spread offense. He's similar, in my opinion, to like a Danny Gray pick for the 49ers. And you might have had better options even at wide receiver there or in the later rounds. But ultimately, I think they see something in Watkins that, just kind of speaks to what they want to move forward with. So, I think this was a solid pick.
Oh, absolutely. we were wondering, for the Niners if they were really, how much of the offense they were really planning on addressing, how
Right.
confident they were going to be with all the injuries around them. So, for them to address it, take a dart throw at a wide receiver here. I think it's a good investment, especially with a guy who has breakaway speed. That's something that you can, it's hard to teach, and if you can find the right spot in that offense, I trust Kyle Shanahan to make the most of his skill players.
Do you, even after he, torched the Super Bowl as many times as he has? Anyway,
Yeah, maybe not. You're right.
let's move on here. Round 5, 147th overall, because I don't want to talk about Super Bowl losses, man. 147th overall. The Niners took a running back, Jordan James out of Oregon. Shocker, right? I like this pick. Nothing super special about his build or his play, but he's decisive. He's a decisive one cut and go type of player, similar to a Jordan Mason who just departed. So he's perfect for the Niners system because he runs with that toughness. He's got the vision, the balance. He's a smart player, and in the Shanny system, he can find success. So he'll be a good 2 or 3 option, and probably providing that much needed depth at the running back position.
Yeah, I think we always knew the Niners were going to take a late round running back. I think that was expected. When I saw his film, I was like, oh, I could definitely see what the Niners are looking for. And Kyle, if there's a position that he can make something out of nothing on, it is that running back position. You guys needed to address the depth. How much do you trust McCaffrey's injury history and Garendo, how good are you guys feeling about it? I think it's always good to have more depth in that room specifically. So you're getting a good young talent in there. I think he's a good back. So yeah, it's a good pickup.
Yeah, and I can absolutely see him taking reps away from Isaac Garendo, who I think Isaac was very solid, but just coming in, I think Jordan James is probably competing for that number 2 or 3 spot, depending on where Isaac lands. So round 5, 160. I'm just going to start blasting these off now. Niners took safety Marquez Siegel. He was a sleeper pick, in my opinion. I really like this pick. He can play both the safety position, and he's been converted from cornerback position. He ran a 4.3 40 dash. He's fast. He's physical, plays and hits downhill, so very similar to a Malik Mustafa. He's listed as a safety, but he can play in the slot as well. He helps with the run support. So overall, I think this is a really solid pickup for the 49ers, and it's really good to have that in the secondary unit. Round 7, 227th overall, we took a quarterback, Curtis Rourke, who was just drafted today in the CFL, the Canada League, to the Saskatchewan Rough Riders, I believe is their name.
I didn't know you could.
Yeah, I didn't either.
I didn't know that was a thing. Oh,
I didn't either.
That's kind of cool. At least he'll get playing time.
So he's got some options here in terms of career choice. Obviously, he'll stick with the Niners. That'll be the more money, and probably a better opportunity, obviously, being in the NFL. But he's got options if the NFL doesn't pan out. Some quick things on him. He played through a torn ACL and took the Hoosiers to a college football tournament playoff. So he's got a good arm. He's got great anticipation. He's 6'4", which in my opinion is that's nice. I like that because we got a small quarterback right now. But he shouldn't have been that low. He shouldn't have fallen that low in the draft, except for that ACL injury. That's why he slid as far as he did. He's got a similar build to a guy like Kirk Cousins, which I think is a lot of the reason why Kyle Shanahan and the Niners ended up drafting him, because Kirk was Kyle's guy for a number of years. I like this pick. It's great value, low risk, good return, and a backup ability. So moving on, round 7, 249th overall, offensive lineman, Connor Colby. This is the first offensive lineman of the draft for the 49ers. They probably should have taken a offensive lineman earlier. Obviously, we talked about that. But Colby can play, though. He's a good athlete who saw starts at right guard, left guard, right tackle during his 4 seasons with the Hawkeyes. He has good size for an interior lineman. The Niners do need more depth on the inside, and Colby might just find his way onto the roster as a rookie. I think he's got every chance to make it through the rookie camp that starts on May 8th. through the ninth, and he's got every chance to continue that through training camp and be a part of that 53 man once the season starts. So solid pick. I'm happy with offensive linemen in general. So, it's depth that's much needed. Last pick of the draft, wide receiver Junior Bergen out of Montana. Will most likely be a kick returner for the Niners this year, depending on Kyle Shanahan, how much he trusts a rookie with any responsibility, but specifically with that responsibility. Last year we saw Jacob Cowing taking punt returns. We saw, obviously Debo taking it. But when Cowing, who was a rookie last year, took those, and he ended up, he muffed one punt, and since then he didn't see a single rep at the punt return position. So a lot of this relies on how much, Kyle Shanahan wants to trust a rookie. But, this was a highly recommended pick from Brent Boyer, who's the Niners special teams coordinator. Bergen was third in Big Sky history at yards per return. He was averaging 16.7 yards, which was also a Montana school record, I believe. And he returned 3 of those to the house. So I think this is a lot of the reason why they took him is because they wanted a set punt returner, regardless whether he's a rookie or not. This is a guy who's established. He knows how to, return a punt, knows how to handle these situations. I think at an NFL level, it should translate pretty smoothly. So I anticipate him to just be the main kick returner this year and punt returner as well. So overall, man, I really solid draft for the Niners. Obviously, they've been, graded all around, up and down the board from A to I've seen as low as C minus. I don't think I saw anything in the D's, but for me, you had 3 glaring issues from last year. You were 29th in run defense. You were 32nd in special teams, and you were 32nd in wide receiver separation. I really think you addressed every single one of those in one way or another, and some of them more than others, especially with that run defense. I'm at this point, like, I dare you to run the ball on this 49ers team if this pans out the way that I expect it to and want it to, because we took some absolute dogs on the defensive line and the defensive side of the football. And that's, to me, like, defense wins championships. What did we see last year in the Super Bowl, Marcos? Y'all gave hell in the trenches to Kansas City. And what did the 49ers do this year? They built the trenches. They solidified those ends. So I'm happy with this draft. Yes, I would have loved to have seen offensive linemen, but I have the belief that the 49ers were sniped of their guys, and they, kind of made a not really a last minute, but they kind of made a pivot move in a way that makes sense to their team anyway. So ultimately, I'm going to give this draft a B+. I'm really pleased with it. I'm not going to scratch the A's yet. If Michael or one of these dudes just has an insane season, we'll rehash this whole thing, and I'll take back my words and tell you it was an A. And if it's the worst draft ever, I'll agree with you. It's probably like a C-. But what were your thoughts on the Niners draft?
I would, honestly, I'd give him a solid B+ as well. And, it does depend on the success of, I would say mainly Michael, but I do think that, I like the fact that the Niners, they were a little older and they were a little slower on defense than what they were in their prime. So what do? You get younger and faster in that position. And I think that, can't be understated how important that movement has been. I mean, the Chiefs were so successful doing it. That same thing, like we said last year, the Eagles are successful doing that same thing. I think there is an element of, having a fresh defense that goes all over the place, makes up for some lack of talent that you have. And especially if you have a good coach like Saleh, the fact that they really embraced that part and said, like, we might only have Saleh for a year, so let's let him pick his guys and see if we can make some magic with it. I think that's a smart way to do it in a year where you really are just trying to find players that stick. So I do think that approach was really good. I don't care about the reaches of it all. I think you guys got good players at positions that you value as an organization, and I always think that that's important to do. And the Niners have done a really good. I think now that these weeks have gone by, initially no one really saw that vision, but I think now that the draft is over and you're like, okay, now these are the holes that we really needed, and they did a really good job here. So I liked the draft for the Niners. I think they did a good job.
Yeah, and one last little thing on the offensive line for anybody who's like really concerned with why the 49ers, weren't able to build the offensive line. And do they care about the offensive line? They absolutely do. And the reason I can tell you they do is if you look at the 30 visit list for the 49ers, they had 8 offensive linemen come in and be a part of that. So I'm sorry, but if they didn't care, they're only going to take what, 2, 3 offensive linemen. They had 8 of those guys come into their building. Those are guys that they're absolutely interested in drafting. So to me, the question isn't if they care about the offensive line. One thing to keep in mind, like their offensive line, like I talked about, they're ranked 13th overall, but a lot of that I think has to do with how long Brock Purdy hangs onto that football. He hangs onto the ball over 30 seconds, which on average is the 6th highest in the NFL. So my belief is that, if you were to just adjust the time to throw, maybe, get back to some of those dink and dunks that Brock Purdy was, established on, and obviously having a guy like Christian McCaffrey back out there for hopefully a full season is going to establish that. You're going to get the ball out of his hands a little bit quicker, and that offensive line is going to look a little bit better. So I think last year was kind of a fluke. Yes, the offensive line needs work. You need to build that depth, and you have to have the predecessor behind Trent Williams, but I think it's going to happen. The 49ers are well aware of what needs to happen with the offensive line. I'm not too concerned.
Yeah, and I don't blame them for attacking defense in this draft. They were, despite how dysfunctional it seemed and how sloppy it looked at times, the Niners were not a team that struggled to move the ball up and down the field. It was about finishing and closing that they struggled. They were a top 10 offense, and the numbers would suggest the same thing. So for them, I understand for the Niners fans out there who want an O lineman, who wanted a better receiver or something like that, maybe to make this offense a little more potent. This offense is potent as it is, even if Kyle
The
Shanahan.
system is potent.
Yeah, Kyle Shanahan and his toys make this offense potent, no matter who he has on there. So you would think that the issue last year was defense, and I do think that. I think the Niners are going to regress to the mean in terms of their red zone struggles. I don't think they're going to struggle as much as they are. I think their kicking is going to even out. They're not going to have the worst kicking in the NFL anymore. Like, I think those things will, we're going to talk about this when we talk about every other team, but I think the Niners are in a spot where they made the right approach and didn't have to listen to the outside noise. They went with defense, and I think that was the right way to approach this draft.
Yeah, exactly. And on the kicking thing, the Niners did just bring in the best kicker in college football last year, and I don't have his name right now, so I apologize. I'll have it at some point. Oh, here it is, Lou Groza. He won the Kenneth Almendaris Award, which is best college kicker award. So they're bringing in competition for Jake Moody, which I think is only going to help Jake if Jake is their guy. Otherwise, you have a pivot point and a guy that you can go to for next year. So
yeah,
they know what they need to address. The questions are, yes, still there, but I think the answers will come. So ultimately, super solid draft. I'm happy with it. Let's move on.
Heck yeah. So no, I think it was a great weekend for both of our teams. I think we both got a lot of good value from this draft. I think we're going to be really excited for what's to come. And we got a lot of big news, now obviously in the Niners side of things, now that Kittle happening, there's more dominoes bound to fall, and we're going to be right there when it happens. But I think for now, we get to glaze up our picks and, see, how good they become over the next few years. We get to see them at those voluntary camps coming up here soon before OTAs kick off in a month or so. But this was a good time. The draft is always a fun time. I'm glad that I'm glad that this experience turned out a lot better in terms of landing one of your dudes, and now you get to see how that pans out. I'm really excited, and I hope that hits. So this is cool. I definitely enjoyed the draft.
It was a ton of fun, and diving into it was a ton of fun too. Last year, in general, it's intimidating to dive into as many players as there is, and to try and kind of compare that to what you expect your team to do, and then what your team expects to do. It's tough to kind of figure out exactly what direction to go in, but having 2 years now to really dive into this, and obviously this year being the second one, I learned a lot from last year. I learned a ton this year, and it's a fun, I highly recommend it, even to people who don't podcast, to just do a little bit of research and use some of these awesome websites to like Budge Draft and whatnot to really understand the players that your team is potentially gunning for, because it's a really good way to wrap your head around what's coming.
Heck yeah, and you get to see the trends that your team makes and, see them buck certain trends. It really does depend. This year was a weird one for, some trends, whether it was how teams approached this draft. And again, this is
Yeah.
what we talked about. The quarterback class being weird this year created a lot of confusion in this draft, and it definitely made it a little more interesting. But yeah, definitely a lot of fun. We look forward to these new faces in the building. We'll get to see how many of these guys stick, and we'll go from there. But we're going to move on. We're going to go on to the NBA. We got to talk to Sacramento Kings because they decided to finalize a new coach. So we'll stay tuned for the break. We will be right back. All right. We are back to talk some Sacramento Kings. So last time we spoke about the Sacramento Kings, they had brought in a new GM into the building, and we weren't sure what the next move was going to be, whether it was going to be getting a new coach or focusing on certain players and everything like that. But the decision has been made by the Sacramento Kings organization. I don't even want to say it was Scott Perry, but the Sacramento Kings have decided to finalize a contract with Doug Christie to make him the full-time head coach of the Sacramento Kings on a multi-year deal moving forward. I do not know the details of the deal. I don't know if they've been released yet. I don't know if Ben has them pulled up, but Doug Christie will remain the head coach of the Sacramento Kings. This comes on the heels of multiple reports of players vouching for Doug Christie, saying that they wanted him to stay. Players in this current regime like Levine, DeMar said good things about him. So the players vouched for Doug to stay, and the Kings did that. What is your, what are some of the things you heard about this? What's your initial takeaway from the Doug Christie signing?
So, I said a number of weeks ago that by running it back with Doug Christie, I don't necessarily agree with that. And I still kind of stand by that. But the reason I feel a lot less, about that than I do now is exactly what you kind of just talked about. The amount of players that came into the front office before any of this was finalized and said, that they want Doug Christie back as head coach. I don't see how you can have all these players come in, whether you're keeping them or not. You can have all these players come in and tell you, I want X person back as my coach. I don't see how then you can go tough. My guy is this guy, and bring him in. I think it would be it would be aggressive. I'll put it that way. It would be an aggressive move, first move for a general manager. And it would, I think, upset a lot of the players. I have a feeling I know which names were the ones that went to the front office. Obviously, one of them that was released was Zach LaVine. He had vouched for him, saying he wants him back. I think these guys like Doug Christie, Marcos. We did see, Doug and the team finish at 27-24 record. So it was above 500. Woo! But it was a crazy season. And it was a season with an essentially brand new team, starting the last 30 or 40 games of the season. So I'm not mad at the move. I would have been curious to see the coaches that would have been up for, debate, because obviously when Scott Perry went on his presser and said, I'll have my decision in a week or two, I had it pretty set in my mind he was running it back with Doug, because you already have your guy in mind if you're putting a timeline on something like that. But the fact you don't necessarily test the waters, you don't see what other options are available, especially with some of these guys who have recently been let go. Could bring back Mike Malone. That would never happen, but why not ask him? You know what I mean? Like, why not have a conversation with him? And obviously, I don't think that would ever happen, but there are guys out there. I would have been curious to see the waters that could have been tested. Ultimately, I think it's probably the right move. Now you really have to build this team and give this team an identity, because Doug Christie needs an identity to work with if he's going to develop a system, and that's something that this team did not have for the last 40 games of the season, was a system.
Right. And that was one of my main concerns was, okay, I understand that he took over the team midway through the season, but you had 40 games, multiple days to practice. You had time to kind of spend time to come up with something that wasn't just, all right, guys, we're going to pretend like we're all playing a My Player on 2K. Everyone just run pick and roll for yourself and see who gets open. I just think that I this is it just screams to me, and here I go being a negative Nelly for Sacramento again. It's just one of those moves to me that just screams, hey, we want to stay in the same spot. Like, hey, we really, we're okay pushing for the play-in every year. We're okay maintaining mediocrity, knowing that there's no real way around it. Because I think if Scott Perry had it his way, I don't think it would be as simple. But that the way the NBA works nowadays, it's harder to move players than it was before. So the conversation becomes more difficult. So maybe they realized, okay, maybe we're not going to have as much turnover on the roster as we thought or planned that we're going to this summer. So might as well try and keep the continuity with the head coach, let them establish an off season together and see if we can develop something. Like, I understand that reality exists, but I'm not going to have any confidence in it until I see it, because all I have to work off of is 40 games of evidence and I won't say 40 games, I will say at least 20 games with the main core, with the stars of this roster in this building. And there were very mixed results. Then Doug had the ability to have them buy in for certain stretches, and there was also stretches where they never looked more checked out. So I was also just like, it will. This is a move that doesn't move it one way or the other for me. It just sends off these signals that, like, we're okay being here and we're okay living in this world until we actually find a way to get out, because we don't really have a way out right now.
Yeah, and that's kind of the concern for me too. I just kind of thought about this. I kind of put this together, and it's call it a theory, I guess. Do you remember during Scott Perry's presser when he was talking about, the coaching position? He was asked about the coaching position and the timeline, blah 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
He had mentioned, his phone's being ringing, off the charts or whatever about this position. If your phone is ringing off the charts for a position, that means you have a ton of people who are interested in the job, which means you have a large pool of people to pull in for interviews. Ain't no way in hell that the Sacramento Kings and Scott Perry and that ownership group interviewed more than maybe 3 guys for this job. One of them being Doug Christie, because it's going to take longer than 2 weeks, a week and a half, to determine your next head coach if you have this many guys to choose from. So part of that, I feel like, and this is where the theory comes in, part of him saying, Scott Perry saying in his presser, my phone's been ringing off the charts. I wonder if that was a way to almost take a stab, not an aggressive or mean stab or anything towards the ownership group, but a stab to let them know there are options outside of what you guys are pushing for. And ultimately, his hands were still tied. A lot of that due to, sure, we'll call it ownership, but I think a lot of it also has to do with the players' opinions and not wanting to create kind of a toxic environment. Obviously you created a toxic environment when you fired Mike Brown. Your star has been asking for your team to move forward with the same coach and stick with this guy because this is my guy. And I've had 5 coaches in 8 years like this. And obviously you fire him like that. Like, it feels like they, potentially didn't want to make another toxic situation, right? So this is kind of like a theory I just kind of came up with, that potentially he was taking a stab at ownership and saying, my phone's been ringing off the charts. And now with this 2 week, a week and a half timeline before you have a new head coach and it being the same head coach, I do wonder how much his hands were tied in this decision.
And I think you made the point right away. They were like the players like Doug, and I think that's a very valid point to make. I think that you know whatever the organization wants, if the players all come together and say that we want Doug, then great. I don't know how much of that is true, and you know I just wonder. I do wonder too if these guys, the Kings, players really just need a reset. And they dealt with so much in the season that maybe an off season is what this team needs to really spend some time together and get used to each other and play with each other. I think it was a little bit, you always want things to work out because you see other teams in the playoffs that make trades and all this stuff. But I think we wanted to see this team do well because on paper it looked like it should have. And I think that there is still a chance for this team to look like a competent team, like a playoff team. But they had some time to make things work during the season. It was going to be tough. If the players want him there, great. I'm not going to complain. But I think overall we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah, all right, brother. So I think outside of that, I think that's some the important news around Sacramento. We'll touch up on anything. We'll come up. The NBA draft's coming up. We'll even figure out if we're even involved in that stuff. We'll talk. May 14th is the day to look out for. The NFL schedule gets released. We're definitely breaking that down when that comes out.
Yeah.
So off-season stuff is coming, y'all. So, the Brock Purdy contract's coming. Like, we're gonna be good, guys. We're gonna have some stuff to talk about here. So, I was really happy with our draft stuff. Happy Doug Christie is here. We're gonna have to wait and see what the heck happens there. So, any final thoughts before we head out here?
Yeah, my final thought, I'll just say I do love Doug Christie. I might seem like I'm upset with this decision. I'm mainly upset with the direction that it feels like this is heading. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, Doug Christie is a Sacramento legend, and he's somebody that is absolutely going to have, he's going to hold his team accountable to a certain level. So I think he'll be a solid head coach. I'm curious to see what the identity looks like, and that's going to be something we talk about here in the coming weeks.
No, absolutely. All right, y'all. So we are going to end that right here. So with that being said, this was episode 86 of the Behind the Back podcast. You can hit us up at behindthebackpod13@gmail.com. For all you watching on YouTube, all of our descriptions, all of our social media links are up above. For all you audio listeners out there, links to the descriptions are down below. Please give us a like, subscribe, rate, review. Follow the show. Give us a comment who your favorite draft pick was from either of our teams or any of the NFL teams during the weekend. Biggest surprise? Were any of you guys shocked about Shedeur falling, all that stuff? For you Sacramento Kings fans, are you happy that Doug Christie is here? Let us know how you feel about that. So please give us a shout out at any time. I am Marcos Conan Negron, and beside me here, as always, is
Ben the Jet Reds.
All right, y'all. We love you. We will talk to you next week. Peace.